Nora Bishop wiped down the counter of the Hoosier Corner Diner, unaware that 6 blocks away a scene was unfolding that would strip a man of everything except the one thing he still had left: the truth of who he really was. 2 men in tailored wool coats stood near the corner of Meridian and Ninth, cameras already raised. Brad Coleman recognized the face first: gaunt, now unshaven but unmistakable beneath the grime and the 3 weeks of sleepless nights. No way. Brad's voice cracked into a laugh, sharp and disbelieving. Tyler, look. Is that Elijah Boone? Tyler Vance turned, phone already lifting. The Elijah Boone, Boone's table. Elijah Boone, sweet Lord. Look at him. Look at what happened to the golden boy. They had gone to Butler together, the 3 of them a decade earlier. Elijah on financial aid, sleeping 4 nights a week in the campus library because his dorm heat had been shut off for non-payment, while Brad and Tyler drove leased convertibles their fathers had bought them freshman year. Back then, Elijah had been charity case, scholarship kid, the boy who wore the same 3 shirts on rotation and flinched when anyone offered to buy him lunch, because accepting felt like admitting something he was too proud to say out loud. He had built an empire since then. He had never once come back to remind them of it. Say something, Boone, Brad called out, grinning at the small crowd already gathering on the sidewalk, phones rising like a field of dark mirrors. Come on, say hi to the internet. Tell everybody how the big shot billionaire ended up looking like this. Elijah did not move. He stood very still in his gray coat, the collar frayed at the seams, his hands buried deep in his pockets, not for effect but because the wind off the White River had been cutting through Indianapolis for 3 days straight, and he had stopped being able to feel his fingers sometime around dawn. Nothing to say. Tyler stepped closer, delighted the way a man delights in kicking something that used to be able to kick back. Man, I heard rumors you were doing research or some nonsense, playing homeless for a few weeks. Cute. Real cute, Elijah. You know, some people don't have to play it. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. The words landed somewhere Elijah had spent 30 years trying to seal shut. Some people don't have to play it. He knew that better than either of them ever would. He knew it in the marrow of his bones, in the particular ache that lived behind his ribs on nights when the temperature dropped below freezing, an ache that had nothing to do with the cold outside and everything to do with a memory he had never told a single person at Boone's table. Not the board, not the investors, not even until recently Walt. He knew what it was to be 5 years old and so hungry that his stomach had stopped growling because it had simply given up asking. He knew what it was to watch his mother's lips turn the color of a bruise while she promised him in a voice gone thin as paper that everything would be fine in the morning. He knew, though he had spent decades trying not to know it, what the sidewalk felt like against a child's cheek when there was nowhere warmer left to lay it. None of that was a performance. None of it had ever left him. He had simply learned over 31 years how to carry it in silence and build something enormous on top of it, the way a person builds a house over a fault line and prays the ground never remembers what it's capable of. Nothing. Brad pressed the phone closer to Elijah's face. Come on, man. Give the people a quote. Billionaire goes broke on purpose because he's bored. Or is it a tax thing? Is this a write-off? A woman in the small crowd laughed. Someone else muttered sad under their breath. The word aimed less like sympathy and more like an insult dressed up as one. Elijah lifted his eyes for the first time since they had cornered him, and what Brad Coleman saw there made his grin falter just slightly, just enough, not anger, but something older and quieter than anger. Something that had been living behind the man's ribs since before either of them had known him. You don't know what this is, Elijah said. His voice came out low, rough from disuse but steady. You never did. He turned and walked away, before either of them could recover enough to follow his shoulders, hunched not from shame, but from 30 years of practice making himself smaller than he was. A habit the body never fully unlearns, no matter how large the office, how tall the tower, how many zeros sit at the end of a signature. Behind him, the laughter died into confused, muttering, the small crowd already losing interest, already scrolling toward the next thing. Nobody followed him. Nobody offered him a coat or a coffee, or 5 minutes of the dignity they would have handed a stranger without a second thought if that stranger had simply looked like them. That was, after all, the entire point of the last 21 days. He walked without a destination for nearly an hour. His sneakers, the good ones, had been left behind in the penthouse closet. These were 3 sizes too big, found in a donation bin, the laces replaced with twine soaking through where the slush had gathered at the curbs. His stomach twisted with a hunger that was at this point no longer performance either. He had eaten almost nothing in 2 days. The dizziness came in waves now, a soft gray static at the edges of his vision that made the storefronts tilt if he turned his head too fast. It was nearly 6 in the morning when he found himself standing outside the Hoosier Corner Diner, again drawn there, the way a man is drawn back to the one place in a cruel city that had not yet been cruel to him. Through the fogged glass he could see her before she saw him, a young woman in a stained apron, dark hair pulled back, moving behind the counter with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that tired feet did not excuse slow hands. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with one bad night. She looked exhausted in the way people look when exhaustion has become a permanent resident inside them, folded into the muscles of the face, until it stops being an expression and becomes a feature. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that her father had died behind a diner counter, very much like this one, or that the ground beneath his own boots held a memory neither of them could yet imagine. He knew only that his hands were shaking, that the cold had worked itself so deep into his chest that his breath came out in visible uneven clouds, and that some instinct older than hunger kept his feet rooted to that particular stretch of sidewalk instead of any other in the entire city. The bell over the door jingled as another customer left. For a moment, warm light and the smell of coffee spilled out onto the street before the door swung shut again, sealing him back into the cold. He did not go to the front. He never did. He went instead to the narrow alley beside the kitchen where the dumpsters sat, where the smell of bleach and old grease hung in the air, and where, if he was patient, if he made himself small and quiet and unthreatening the way 30 years of instinct had taught him, someone occasionally left something behind before it went into the trash. He leaned against the brick, sank slowly down onto the frozen concrete, and closed his eyes. Somewhere behind that door, a young woman was scraping the last of the breakfast oatmeal into a pot, deciding without knowing why that this morning she was not going to let the pot go empty before checking outside one more time. Neither of them knew yet what the next few minutes would set in motion. Neither of them could have known that a bowl of oatmeal offered without hesitation on a freezing Indianapolis morning was about to become the first thread in a story that stretched back 31 years to another cold night, another hungry child, and a stranger who had once tried and failed to save the woman he loved most in the world. The bell above the door did not ring for Elijah Boone that morning. Nora Bishop came to him instead, out through the kitchen side exit into the alley, where the cold pooled thick between the brick walls and the dumpster lids sat rimed with frost. She found him sitting with his knees drawn up to his chest, head bowed, breath escaping in ragged little clouds that seemed for a moment like the only proof he was still alive at all. She had seen him there for 3 weeks now, always in the same gray coat, always silent, always careful not to take up more space than the world seemed willing to give him. But this morning, something in the stillness of him frightened her. "Hey," she said, crouching down so she wasn't looking down at him. "Hey, look at me." His eyes opened slowly, and for a fraction of a second before recognition settled in, there was nothing behind them at all. Only the flat, gray exhaustion of a man who has stopped expecting anything good to happen to him. Then he saw the bowl in her hand, steam curling up from it into the freezing air, and something in his face cracked open like ice giving way beneath a boot. "You don't have to," he said. His voice came out thin, scraped raw by the cold. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Your lips are blue." She pressed the bowl into his hands, wrapping his fingers around the warmth of it herself when he was too stiff to manage it alone. "Eat. Slowly. Small bites, or you'll make yourself sick." He ate the way a starving man eats when he has trained himself out of some buried instinct not to eat too fast in front of people who might change their minds. Nora watched him without judgment, without the particular cruelty of curiosity that she had seen in so many others who passed this alley. The sideways glances, the whispered comments, the phones lifted just long enough to capture something to laugh about later. She simply watched him, the way a person watches someone hurting, because watching sometimes is its own kind of holding on. "What's your name?" she asked when the bowl was nearly empty and some color had crept back into his face. "Eli," he said. It was not quite a lie. It had simply stopped being the whole truth a long time ago, the day his father's lawyers had insisted on the more respectable Elijah for the letterhead. The press releases the gold lettering above 200 storefronts across the Midwest. Well, Eli. Nora stood brushing frost from her knees. There's more where that came from tomorrow, and the day after that. I don't care what anybody says about you. She did not wait for him to thank her. She simply went back through the kitchen door, and Elijah Boone sat alone in the alley for a long moment afterward, staring at the empty bowl in his hands, feeling something move in his chest that he had not felt in longer than he could. To remember not pity, which he had grown almost immune to, and not charity, which always came in his experience with an invisible price tag attached. This had been something else. This had asked for nothing at all. The next morning, Elijah Boone did not return to the diner. Instead, he sat in a boardroom on the 41st floor of a glass tower downtown, dressed in a suit that had not touched his body in 21 days, his hands folded on a mahogany table, while 11 members of the Boone's table executive board stared at him like a man they were no longer certain they recognized. The stock dipped 6 points this week, said the chief financial officer, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had worked for Elijah's father before she had ever worked for Elijah. Investors don't like silence, Elijah. They especially don't like silence from a chairman nobody can locate. I was reachable, Elijah said quietly. I simply wasn't reachable in the way you're used to. You disappeared, said another board member, younger, impatient, the kind of man who had inherited his seat rather than earned it, for 3 weeks. No explanation. Do you have any idea what that looks like? Elijah did not answer. He had learned over the years that silence in a boardroom was often mistaken for weakness when in truth it was frequently the only thing keeping a man from saying something he could never take back. It was Walt Higgins who finally broke the tension, appearing in the doorway with his cane tapping once against the marble floor, before he waved the rest of the board out with a tired flick of his hand. Give us the room, he said, and something in his voice, 30 years of earned authority wrapped in the patience of an old friend, made even Carol Whitfield rise without argument. When the door clicked shut, Walt lowered himself slowly into the chair across from Elijah, wincing as his bad hip settled. You look like hell, Walt said. Thank you. I mean it, Elijah. You look like a man who hasn't slept properly in 3 weeks and hasn't eaten a full meal in 2, which as it happens is exactly what you are. Walt leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dropping into something gentler than the frustration from a moment before. The board is asking questions I can't keep answering for you. Real ones. Where does the chairman of Boone's table go for 21 days and come back smelling like a bus station, with frost still in his hair? You could have been robbed out there. Beaten. Worse. For what, some experiment? It's not an experiment, Walt. Then what is it? Walt's voice cracked just slightly, the crack of a man who has spent 3 decades being afraid for someone else's safety and has finally run out of room to hide it. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man throwing himself back into the exact kind of suffering he spent his whole life climbing out of, and I would like to understand why before it gets you killed. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window behind Walt's shoulder, Indianapolis spread out gray and glittering under a sky, the color of old dishwater. The same city that had once let a 5-year-old boy watch his mother die on a sidewalk without a single stranger stopping to help. My father built 200 diners out of 1 lunch counter in Terre Haute, Elijah said finally. And when he died, every single person in this city who used to call him a friend started calling me instead. Not about him, not about grief, but about money, about access, about what I could do for them now that I had his name attached to mine. I wanted to know if there was anyone left in this city who would treat a stranger like a human being instead of a wallet. Just one person. That's all I was looking for. Walt studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. He had known Elijah Boone since they were 9 years old, back when Elijah's mother used to bring him to the shelter on Meridian Street because there had been nowhere else for either of them to sleep. He had watched this same boy grow into a man who flinched even now, even after everything, whenever someone offered him something for free. He understood better than anyone left alive exactly what wound Elijah was circling, and Walt asked quieter now. 21 days. Anybody? Elijah's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had walked into the boardroom, something almost like warmth passed across his face, brief and fragile and entirely unguarded. 1, he said. Her name is Nora. Walt sat back slowly in his chair, the frustration in his face giving way inch by inch to something closer to worry. Not for Elijah's safety this time, but for the far more dangerous thing that had clearly already begun to take root in a heart that had spent 31 years refusing to let anyone close enough to break it again. Elijah, Walt said carefully, I need you to tell me you know what you're doing. Elijah did not answer that either. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall over the city, soft and silent, settling over rooftops and sidewalks alike, without any regard for who among them had somewhere warm to go home to and who did not. A few mornings later, the snow had thickened into a hard crust along the curbs of Ninth Street, and Elijah Boone returned to the alley behind the Hoosier Corner Diner, the way a man returns to the only warmth he has left in a world that had otherwise gone cold in every direction. He had not planned to keep coming back. He had told himself the first morning that this was simply part of the search, one more data point in a city he was quietly, methodically testing for the presence of a single decent heart. But by the fifth morning, he had stopped pretending even to himself that Nora Bishop was merely a data point. By the 10th, he found that his feet carried him toward that particular stretch of sidewalk before his mind had consciously decided to go there at all. She never asked him for anything. That more than the food was what undid him each time. In 31 years of living inside a body, the world had first ignored, and then once it noticed the Boone name attached to it, suddenly could not stop trying to extract something from Elijah, had grown fluent in every form kindness, could take when it expected something in return admiration. Gratitude access a favor banked for later. Nora's kindness asked for none of it. She simply kept a plate warm behind the register, refilled his coffee without comment, and let him eat in a silence that did not feel like judgment, only like room enough to breathe. "You're quiet today," she said one morning, wiping down the counter near where he sat on an overturned milk crate, just outside the kitchen door, the closest thing to a chair the alley offered, and the closest thing to being invited inside, that either of them had yet allowed. "I'm always quiet," Elijah said. "No. There's quiet, and there's this quiet." She nodded at him, arms crossed, studying him with the particular directness of someone who had spent her whole life learning to read exhaustion on other people's faces because she had spent so many years wearing it on her own. "Something's sitting on you today. Heavier than usual." He almost told her the truth then, that a boy named Brad Coleman had put a phone in his face 2 days earlier, that the video had already gathered thousands of views by the time Walt found it, laughing. Captions stacked beneath a frozen image of Elijah's own hollowed-out face. He almost told her that the word pathetic had appeared so many times in the comments that he had eventually made himself stop reading them, though the words had already done what words do, burrowed in somewhere and stayed. Instead, he said only "bad couple of days." "Yeah." Something in her expression softened, not with pity but with recognition. "I know what those feel like." She glanced back toward the register, lowering her voice slightly, as if the admission cost her something. "My dad used to run a diner not far from here. 2 blocks over, actually. Bishop's Kitchen. It's gone now, has been for about 6 years. What happened to it? Bank called in his loan early. No warning. He'd never missed a payment in 15 years, and then one week they just decided they weren't going to wait anymore." Her jaw tightened just slightly, the old anger still sitting close to the surface even after all this time. "He tried everything to save it. Sold his truck. Sold my mom's jewelry. Worked 18-hour days trying to make up the difference. It didn't matter. 2 weeks after the bank took the building, his heart gave out behind his own counter." She said it plainly, the way people learn to say the worst thing that ever happened to them once they've told it enough times that the words have worn smooth like a stone carried too long in a pocket. "I was 20. My sister was 11. My mom's never really been the same since." Elijah sat very still, something cold moving through his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He thought of his own mother's hands, how thin they had become in her final weeks, how she had still tried to smile at him even when smiling clearly cost her more than she had left to give. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and meant it in a way that went far deeper than the 2 words could carry. "Yeah, well." Nora shrugged, though her eyes had gone bright and wet at the corners. "It's why I do this, I guess. Keep an eye out. Make sure nobody else falls through the cracks the way we did if I can help it. Doesn't fix anything, but it's something." "You should go into a real business," Elijah said before he could stop himself. "You've got the head for it. The way you run this counter, the way you read people, keep everyone moving, never lose track of a single order even when it's slammed in here, that's not luck. That's a skill most executives I've sat across a boardroom table from don't have." Nora laughed, but there was no bitterness in it, only the particular exhaustion of someone who has heard a version of this compliment before and long ago stopped believing it applied to her actual life. "I don't have money for a real business, Eli. I've got a shift schedule, a bus pass, and about $400 in a savings account I'm too scared to touch." "Money's not the only thing that builds something," he said. "Sometimes it's just the last piece. The rest of it, the instinct, the discipline, the way you treat people even when nobody's watching, that has to already be there first." She looked at him a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, something curious, crossing her face as though she were trying to place an accent that didn't quite belong to a man who slept behind dumpsters, a certain cadence in the way he spoke that sounded, despite everything, like someone who had once stood in rooms very different from this alley. "You talk funny for a guy living rough," she said, not unkindly. "I read a lot," he said, which was true if not the whole truth, and let it lie there between them, the way he let most things lie, unfinished those days, not because he wanted to deceive her, but because some truth spoken too soon had a way of collapsing everything good that had not yet had time to properly take root. That evening, back in the penthouse, he still could not make himself feel entirely at home. Elijah stood at the window overlooking the frozen city and turned the day's conversation over and over in his mind the way a man worries a stone smooth in his pocket. Bishop's kitchen. 2 blocks over. 6 years ago. Bank called in the loan early. Something about the timeline nagged at him, a discomfort he could not yet name, the way a person senses a draft in a house before they find the window left open. Walt found him there an hour later, letting himself in with the spare key he had carried since Elijah's father's days, his cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor. "You're doing that thing again," Walt said, settling into the chair by the fire without being asked. "That thing where you go quiet and stare out a window like the glass owes you an explanation." "Her father had a diner," Elijah said, not turning around. "Bishop's kitchen. Went under 6 years ago. Bank called in the loan with no warning after 15 years of clean payments. He died 2 weeks later. Heart attack behind his own counter." Walt was quiet for a moment. "That's a hell of a thing to carry." "I want you to pull the county property records," Elijah said. "The building. Who owns it now? Who's owned it since the auction? I want to know everything." "Why?" Elijah finally turned from the window, and in the dim firelight, Walt saw something in his old friend's face he had not seen in a very long time. Not the careful, guarded expression Elijah wore in boardrooms, and not even the raw hunger of the last 3 weeks, but something more fragile than either. Something that looked more than anything like hope, trying very hard not to be recognized as hope for fear of what it would cost if it turned out to be misplaced. "Because if there's any way I can quietly buy that building back and put it in her name without her ever having to know it came from me," Elijah said. "I want to do it before I let myself feel anything else about that woman. I want to give her something real first. Something that doesn't depend on whether or not I ever tell her who I actually am." Walt studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, already reaching for the folder of documents he had, as it happened, begun pulling together 3 days earlier, the moment he had first suspected where all of this was heading. "I'll have something for you by morning," Walt said. "Elijah, just brace yourself. Sometimes when you go digging into the past, you find out it was already digging its way toward you." He did not yet know how right he was. Walt Higgins did not sleep that night. He sat at the long table in his cluttered study, surrounded by bankers' boxes he had not opened in over a decade, the kind of boxes that accumulate in the corners of a life spent quietly managing someone else's affairs. Old deeds, old contracts, folders labeled in a handwriting he recognized instantly and had not seen in 7 years. Elijah's father's handwriting, careful, slanted, the letters pressed hard enough into the paper that you could still feel the shape of them on the reverse side if you ran a thumb across the back of the page. By 4 in the morning he had found it. He arrived at Elijah's penthouse before sunrise, still in yesterday's clothes, his cane striking an uneven rhythm against the marble lobby floor, as the night doorman waved him through without needing to ask. Elijah opened the door himself, hair disheveled, a mug of untouched coffee cooling on the counter behind him, and one look at Walt's face told him that whatever his old friend had found, it was not going to be simple. "Elijah." Walt's voice was low, careful, the voice of a man delivering news he has not yet fully made peace with himself. "Sit down. Just tell me. Sit down anyway." Elijah sat. Walt set the folder on the coffee table between them and did not open it right away, his hand resting flat against the cover as though he needed a moment longer to hold the weight of it before passing it on. "The building on 9th Street, Bishop's Kitchen, was sold at auction 6 years ago, right after the bankruptcy," Walt said. "Bought through a shell company called Meridian Holdings. So buy it back," Elijah said, already reaching for his phone. "Quietly, through a different entity. She never has to know where it came from." "Elijah." Walt's hand came down gently over his friend's wrist, stopping him. "You don't understand. Meridian Holdings isn't some stranger's company. It's ours. It's Boone's table. Your company bought that building 6 years ago under your father's final signature, one of the last deals he ever personally authorized before he passed." The room seemed to tilt very slightly, the way a floor sometimes does in the half-second before a person realizes they have missed a step on a staircase. "That's not possible," Elijah said. "I would have known. I sign off on every major acquisition personally. I've signed off on every acquisition for 7 years. You signed off on the ones that came after you took over," Walt said quietly. "This one predates that. It happened in the final 18 months of your father's life, back when you were still finishing your MBA in Chicago and hadn't yet come back to run daily operations. It never crossed your desk because he made sure it never crossed your desk." Walt finally opened the folder, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a handwritten note, unsigned, tucked into the back of the original acquisition file. The ink faded but still legible in the same careful, slanted hand that had written every birthday card Elijah had ever received from his father. "Watch over this family. Don't let them lose everything. Don't let them ever know it was us." Elijah read it 3 times before the words fully settled. He thought of his father in those last months, a man who had grown increasingly distant in Elijah's memory, quieter at dinner, prone to long silences at the head of the table that Elijah had at the time mistaken for the ordinary exhaustion of a man running an empire. He had never once suspected that behind that silence his father had been quietly, deliberately protecting a family neither of them had ever met in person. "Why?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why this family? Out of every business that's ever gone under in this city, why did he reach into his own company's holdings to save this one and then hide it so completely that even I never found out?" "I don't know," Walt admitted. "But there's more." He pulled a second document from the folder, older, the paper yellowed with age. In a way, the acquisition file was not the typeface belonging to an era decades earlier than the auction records. It was a county archive listing the kind of document that exists in triplicate in some forgotten basement filing room, cross-referencing property addresses against historical incident reports. This same address, the corner where Bishop's kitchen used to stand, comes up in a record from 31 years ago, Walt said. "Long before the diner even existed in the form your father eventually protected. I haven't finished tracing it all the way through yet. But Elijah, I think you need to sit with this a while before I say anything else. I think this goes back further than either of us was prepared for." Elijah stared at the paper in his hands, the address blurring slightly, as something at the edge of his memory stirred unbidden. The particular slant of a curb, the exact angle where a street lamp had once thrown a cone of orange light across a stretch of frozen sidewalk. A memory he had spent 3 decades keeping locked so far down that even he had nearly convinced himself he'd imagined the details wrong. "I need to know everything," Elijah said. "Whatever it is, I need to know before I let myself get any closer to her." "Elijah." "Whatever my father was protecting her family from," Elijah said, his voice hardening now, the shock giving way to something more resolute. "I need to understand it before I become part of her life in any deeper way. If there's a debt owed to that family, if there's history here that predates me, predates even my father's death, then I owe it to her and I owe it to him to find out exactly what it is before I let myself want anything more than I already do." Walt studied his old friend for a long moment, seeing in his face not the polished chairman who sat across boardroom tables from investors twice his age, but the same 9-year-old boy who used to stand very still and very quiet in the doorway of the Meridian Street shelter, watching the door for a mother who would sometimes be gone for hours at a time, never quite certain whether stillness would keep him safe or simply make him easier to overlook. "Give me a few more days," Walt said, finally gathering the papers back into the folder with careful, deliberate hands. "There's a name in the older record I haven't been able to place yet. Once I do, I don't think either of us is going to be able to look at this the same way again." He rose, slowly wincing as his hip protested the long night of sitting hunched over old files, and paused at the door before letting himself out. "Elijah," he said, not turning around. "For what it's worth, your father wasn't a cold man. Whatever he was hiding, whatever debt he was quietly paying down all those years without ever telling you, I don't think it came from guilt. I think it came from something closer to gratitude. Men don't usually go to that much trouble to protect a stranger's family, unless that family gave them something first that they never knew how to properly repay." The door clicked shut behind him, and Elijah sat alone in the gray, early light of morning, the handwritten note still trembling faintly in his hand, the city outside his window beginning slowly to wake, utterly unaware that 2 blocks away on a stretch of frozen sidewalk outside a small diner, Counter a Clouve, young woman was scraping the last of the morning's oatmeal into a bowl, carrying forward without knowing it. A kindness her own father had once shown a dying stranger on that exact corner. 31 years before she was born into a debt she never knew her family was owed. 3 days passed before Walt returned, and in that time Elijah did not go back to the alley behind the Hoosier Corner Diner even once. He told himself it was discipline that he owed it to Nora and to whatever truth Walt was still assembling to wait until he understood the whole shape of it before he let himself sit across from her again. But in the quiet hours of those 3 nights alone in the penthouse with the city lights blurring against the window glass, discipline was not really what kept him away. It was fear. A fear he recognized instantly because he had carried some version of it his entire adult life. The fear of what a person might find if they finally allowed themselves to dig down to the bottom of the thing they had spent 31 years building a life on top of. Walt arrived on the 3rd evening, not with his usual brisk knock but with something slower, more hesitant, as though even his knuckles understood the weight of what he was about to carry through the door. He was not alone. In his free hand he held a slim leather folder worn soft at the corners with age, and Elijah recognized it at once, as belonging to a filing cabinet in his father's old private study. A cabinet Elijah had never once been given combination to, not even after the funeral. "Sit down," Walt said again, and this time Elijah did not argue. They sat across from each other at the same table where 3 nights earlier Elijah had first learned that his own company had quietly purchased a stranger's ruined diner. Walt set the leather folder down between them, and for a long moment, simply looked at it, his jaw working as though he were trying to find a gentler way into words that had no gentle way in. 31 years ago, Walt began. A woman collapsed on a sidewalk on 9th Street. It was late November. Cold snap that year, one of the worst the city had seen in a decade. She'd been without a proper meal for days, without a coat that actually kept the wind out. She had a boy with her, 5 years old. Elijah's hands resting on the table had gone very still. The diner on that corner had already closed for the night. Walt continued, but there was a young line cook who'd stayed late doing prep for the morning shift. Through the window he saw her go down. He ran outside, tried to get her up, tried to get her inside where it was warm. Called for an ambulance himself from the payphone on the corner because back then that's what you did. Walt's voice thickened, and he had to stop, swallow, steady himself before he could go on. But she'd gone too many days without proper food, without proper warmth, without anyone stopping to help before that night. By the time the ambulance arrived, there wasn't anything left for them to do. The room had gone very quiet. Somewhere below, faint and distant, the sound of the city continued on, indifferent the way cities always do, regardless of what is breaking apart in the rooms above them. That line cook, Walt said, held the boy the whole time, wrapped him in his own coat, sat with him on that freezing sidewalk until someone came to collect him because nobody could reach any family and the boy was too frightened and too cold to say much of anything at all. He opened the folder at last and slid 2 things across the table. A photocopy of a decades-old incident report, half the fields faded past legibility, and beneath it a single photograph, its edges soft and worn from handling. Elijah looked down and felt the floor of his entire life quietly give way beneath him. The photograph showed a young man no older than 19 or 20 in a diner apron still dusted with flour kneeling on a sidewalk. Elijah would have known blind in the dark from memory alone. Beside him, pressed into the folds of the young man's own coat, was a small boy with dark, wide, terrified eyes staring at nothing or at everything, or at a version of the world that had just permanently rearranged itself in ways too large for a 5-year-old to name. "That's me," Elijah said. His voice did not sound like his own voice. It sounded like something being pulled up from very far underground. "That's Walt. That's the corner. That's 9th Street. That's the exact." He could not finish. He did not need to. Walt was already nodding his own eyes, wet, his hand trembling slightly where it rested on the edge of the table. "The line cook's name was Robert Bishop," Walt said quietly. "He was 19 years old. He never told anyone what happened that night, not his wife, not even his own daughters as far as I've been able to find. But your father knew. I don't know how he found out or when, but he knew, and he never forgot the one person in this entire city who ran outside into the cold to try to save the woman everyone else had simply walked past. That's why he bought that building in secret when it went under 6 years ago. That's why he left that note. 30 years of quiet gratitude, Elijah, and he never once told you why." Elijah sat with the photograph in his shaking hands, and for a long moment, something inside him that had been sealed shut since he was 5 years old cracked open all at once. 31 years of carefully constructed distance, collapsing into something raw and unguarded, and entirely without armor. He remembered now in fragments too vivid to have ever truly been forgotten, only buried. The particular texture of wool against his cheek, scratchy and smelling of flour and grease. A voice low and frightened, but trying so hard to sound calm, telling him it would be all right, telling him to keep his eyes open, to keep looking at him, just keep looking at him, don't look away. The sound of sirens arriving too late to matter. His mother's hand growing cold in his small one. her fingers uncurling from around his before anyone had the chance to warm them back up. He had spent 31 years believing he had survived that night entirely alone. He had never once known that a 19-year-old boy, a stranger, with nothing more to offer than his own coat and his own desperate, useless hope, had held him through the worst of it, and then carried the weight of that failure, silently for the rest of his life. He raised a daughter, Elijah said finally, his voice barely a whisper, who scrapes the bottom of an oatmeal pot for a stranger she's never met because her father taught her to give her hand first and ask questions later. He looked up at Walt, and something in his face had changed permanently, the way a landscape changes after an earthquake, not destroyed but reshaped. The fault lines finally visible on the surface instead of buried where no one could see of them. She's not a coincidence, Walt. I stood on the exact spot where my mother died, and a bishop fed me again. Walt reached across the table and gripped his friend's forearm the way he had gripped it 1,000 times over 30 years of friendship. Through every version of Elijah, the frightened 9-year-old at the shelter, the exhausted college student, too stubborn to accept a ride home, the grieving young man standing at his father's graveside trying not to let anyone see him shake. I think your father spent 30 years waiting for you to find your own way back to this corner, Walt said softly, without ever being told why it mattered. He didn't want to hand you the answer. I think he wanted you to earn it the same way Robert Bishop earned it that night, by choosing on your own to stop and help a stranger instead of walking past. Elijah did not speak for a long time. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun again, drifting soundlessly past the window, settling over a city that had once a long time ago let a woman die on a sidewalk because no one else had thought to stop. She doesn't know, Elijah finally said. Nora doesn't know any of this. She has no idea what she's healing every time she hands me that bowl. No, Walt agreed quietly. She just does what her father taught her. She has no idea she's finishing something he started 31 years before she was even born. Elijah closed his eyes, the photograph still trembling in his hands, and for the first time in 3 decades he allowed himself to grieve. Not quietly, not in the careful, contained way he had trained himself to grieve in boardrooms and behind closed office doors, but fully the way a 5-year-old boy should have been allowed to grieve on a frozen sidewalk 31 years ago, if only someone had stayed long enough afterward to let him. A few evenings later, Diane Bishop noticed the change in her daughter before Nora had said a single word about it. It was there in the way Nora hummed while she folded laundry at the kitchen table, a habit she hadn't fallen back into since long before her father passed. It was there in the softness that had crept back into her face, a softness Diane had feared somewhere in the last 6 years might never fully return. You're smiling too much for someone who works 6 days a week, Diane said, setting 2 mugs of tea on the table and lowering herself into the chair across from her daughter with the particular care of a woman whose knees had never quite recovered from years of standing behind a diner counter, beside her late husband. Sit with me a minute. I have news. Good news for once. Mom, I really need to. Preston Ashford's son, Trent. Diane said the name the way a person says the name of a lifeline, something to grab hold of before the current pulls them under again. The one with the cars. The one who took over Ashford Financial when his father stepped back. He's been asking about you, Nora. Asking specifically. Nora set down the shirt she had been folding. Mom, I don't want Trent Ashford. I don't even know him. You know what I know. Diane's voice cracked thin and sudden, the crack of a woman who has spent 6 years holding herself together through sheer force of will, and occasionally, without warning, loses her grip on the seams. I know what it is to marry for love, and bury a husband with more debt than we had years left in this life to pay off. Your father was a good man, Nora. The best man I ever knew. And it wasn't enough. Love wasn't enough to keep the roof over our heads. And it wasn't enough to keep his heart beating behind that counter when the bank decided 15 years of trust didn't matter anymore. I will not stand here and watch you walk that same road with your eyes closed. Nora's throat tightened. She reached across the table and covered her mother's hand with her own, feeling how thin it had become over the years, how much of Diane Bishop had quietly worn away in the effort of simply continuing. There's someone else, Mom, she said quietly. A man I've been helping. He doesn't have anything right now, no job, no home, nothing to his name. But there's something in him. Something real. I've never met anyone who listens the way he listens, who sees people the way he sees them. Diane's face went pale, then flushed dark with something closer to panic than anger. A homeless man. The words came out flat, disbelieving. You are telling me about a homeless man while Trent Ashford is asking for you by name. His name is Eli, Nora said, standing now, her voice steady even as her eyes burned. And someday, Mom, you are going to be ashamed you said it like that. She left the kitchen before either of them could say something. Neither would be able to take back and upstairs alone in the small bedroom she had slept in since childhood. She sat on the edge of her bed and let herself cry, not out of anger at her mother, whose fear she understood far better than she let on, but out of the exhausting, grinding weight of trying to hold two truths at once, that her mother's terror came from love, and that love alone had not saved her father, and that none of that changed what Nora felt every single morning when she carried a bowl of oatmeal out into the cold. 3 evenings later, Nora withdrew $4,000 from the small savings account. She had built one careful deposit at a time over 3 years, money meant for her younger sister's tuition money. She had gone without new shoes and warm winter coats to protect money that represented, in its own quiet way, the last unbroken promise she had made to her father before he died, that she would see Paige through school, whatever it cost her personally to do it. She found Eli in the alley behind the diner just after closing the streetlights overhead, casting long, pale shadows across the frozen concrete. He looked, as he always did lately, like a man carrying something heavier than the cold alone could account for, though Nora had no way of knowing that 3 days earlier that same man had learned the true weight of the ground he was standing. "Oh, I need you to take this," she said, pressing the envelope into his hands before he could protest. Eli looked down at it, then back up at her, something flickering across his face that Nora mistook in that moment for simple confusion. "Nora, I can't." "You can, and you're going to." Her voice was firm, though her hands trembled slightly around his. "Start something. A food cart. A small repair business. Anything. Stand on your own feet, Eli. You have more sense and more heart than half the men in this city who've never had to fight for a single thing in their lives. You deserve a real chance, not just a bowl of oatmeal every morning. This is everything you've saved," he said quietly. "I know what this represents to you. I know what you're giving up. Then you know exactly how much I mean it." She folded his fingers closed around the envelope, the same gesture she had used weeks earlier to close his hands around a bowl too hot for numb fingers to hold on their own. "And when you're standing on your own 2 feet again, really standing, maybe you'll still want me standing next to you. That's the only thing I'm asking for in return. Nothing else." Elijah Boone, who owned 200 diners across 4 states, who could have purchased the entire block they were standing on without noticing the dent in his accounts, stood in that alley, holding $4,000 that represented the whole of a young woman's sacrifice, and found that he could not speak at all. Something in his chest, the same fault line Walt had cracked open 3 nights earlier with a photograph, and an old man's handwritten note, widened further, until it felt less like a wound and more like a door standing open for the first time in 31 years. He did not spend a single dollar of it. He never would. That night, back in the penthouse, he had the envelope framed, the paper worn soft at the corners from her hands, the amount written in her own careful writing on a small note tucked inside. "For a fresh start, you matter. N." And set it on the shelf in his private study beside the photograph Walt had given him, the 2 objects sitting together like bookends on either side of the same unbearable healing truth, that 31 years apart, 2 members of the same family had each, without knowing the cost to themselves, chosen to save him. He thought, staring at the framed envelope in the low lamplight of his father's note. "Watch over this family. Don't let them lose everything." He understood now with a clarity that arrived less like an idea and more like something settling permanently into place, that his father had not simply been repaying an old debt from a distance. He had been quietly, desperately hoping that one day his son might find his own way back to this family, not through money, not through a signature on an acquisition file, but through the same door Robert Bishop had once run through on a freezing November night, the simple, unbearable act of choosing to stop and help. Trent Ashford arrived at the Bishop house on a Friday evening, in a car that cost more than the house itself, its polished black exterior throwing back the porch light, like something deliberately designed to remind the neighborhood of exactly what it was looking at. He carried a bouquet so large it nearly obscured his face, an assistant trailing 2 steps behind him with a second, smaller arrangement, meant apparently for Diane. "You should have told me how beautiful you were," Trent said the moment Nora opened the door, reaching for her hand before she had fully decided whether to offer it. His grip was firm, practiced the handshake of a man who had learned charm the way other men learn accounting, as a transferable skill applied identically regardless of the person in front of him. "I don't like waiting for what I want, Nora Bishop. I've been waiting 3 weeks already." "Mr. Ashford," Nora said, extracting her hand as gently as she could manage. "Please come in." Diane appeared in the hallway behind her, practically luminous with relief, ushering Trent toward the good chairs in the living room, the ones normally covered in a plastic sheet the rest of the year, reserved for company that mattered. "Trent, please sit. Can I get you something, coffee?" We have a nice bottle of coffee's fine Mrs. Bishop, black. Trent settled into the armchair that had once belonged to Robert Bishop, though nobody in the room said so out loud, and surveyed the small living room with the polite, faintly amused expression of a man touring a museum exhibit he found charming precisely because it was so far beneath him. Page 17, and perched on the staircase where she could observe without technically participating, rolled her eyes at her older sister's obvious discomfort, then caught Trent glancing her way, and sat up a little straighter, smoothing her hair with the particular vanity of a teenager who has just discovered that money, even second-hand, and directed at someone else, has a gravity all its own. So Trent said, turning the full weight of his attention back to Nora, "Your mother tells me you work at a diner. Hoosier Corner, is it? I'll have to stop by sometime. See you in your element." "You don't need to do that," Nora said quickly. "Nonsense. I like seeing where people actually spend their time. Tells you more about a person than any resume ever could." He smiled a smile that did not quite reach the calculation still visible behind his eyes. "Ashford Financial's been looking at some interesting redevelopment opportunities on the east side as it happens. Old commercial lots. Foreclosed properties. There's real money sitting in this city if you know where to look for it, and I always know where to look." Something in the way he said it made the back of Nora's neck prickle, though she could not have said exactly why. Later that night, after Trent's car had pulled away, and Diane had gone to bed, still glowing with the particular relief of a mother who believes for the first time in years that her family's luck might finally be turning, Paige cornered Nora in the kitchen while she washed the good china by hand. "You had 2 men chasing you," Paige said, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe with the exaggerated exasperation only a younger sister can produce on command, "and you picked the one who sleeps outside a diner dumpster. Do you have any idea how that makes this family look?" "I don't care how it looks, Paige. I care what it is." "Must be nice," Paige muttered too. "Always get to be the good one. The one who sacrifices. The one who gets to feel special, giving her savings away to some stranger while the rest of us just have to sit here and watch what it costs everybody else." Nora set down the plate she'd been drying, hurt flashing across her face before she could stop it. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" Paige's voice cracked, and for just a moment beneath the teenage bravado, something raw surfaced. The particular grief of a younger sister who had lost her father at 11 years old and spent the 6 years since watching her older sister quietly absorb all the weight their mother could no longer carry without anyone ever asking Paige what she had lost or what she needed. "You get to be the martyr, Nora. I just get to be the one everybody worries is going to turn out selfish if I don't say the right things at the right time." Nora opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeing for the first time in her sister's face an exhaustion that mirrored her own, different in its particulars, but cut from the same cloth of a family that had never fully finished grieving. "I'm sorry," Nora said quietly. "I didn't know you felt that way." "You never ask," Paige said, and left the kitchen before either of them could say anything more, the conversation hanging unfinished in the space between them, a wound neither sister yet knew how to close. Across town, in a different alley behind a different building, Elijah Boone, still in his gray coat, still carrying the particular quiet that had settled over him since the night Walt showed him. The photograph knelt beside an elderly man, seated outside the downtown Mission on Delaware Street. The man's name was Frank Doyle, 78 years old, a retired machinist who had lost his apartment 8 months earlier when a rent increase outpaced his fixed income by a margin no amount of careful budgeting could close. He held a cardboard sign with trembling hands, the ink smudged from rain, and coughed in a way that worried Elijah more than the man seemed willing to admit. "You should see a doctor about that cough," Elijah said, settling down onto the curb beside him without hesitation, the way he had learned to sit beside people over the last 3 weeks. Not above them, not across from them, but level shoulder to shoulder, the posture of someone who had stopped needing to be looked up to in order to feel like he mattered. "Can't afford a doctor," Frank said, not unkindly, the way a man states a fact he's long since stopped being angry about. "Can't afford much of anything these days." Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper, not money, which he had learned over 3 weeks tended to draw unwanted attention on a street corner, but a card for a downtown pharmacy, along with a note he'd had Walt quietly arrange that morning. "There's a prescription waiting for you at Delaware Pharmacy 2 blocks up. Already paid for. No questions asked at the counter, no paperwork. Just walk in and give them your name." Frank stared at the card, then at Elijah, his weathered face folding into something between disbelief and suspicion. "Why, you don't know me from Adam." "I don't need to know you to see you're struggling," Elijah said. It was, he realized only after the words left his mouth, almost exactly what Nora had once said to him in an alley 3 weeks earlier. The sentence had traveled unbidden from her mouth into his own, planting itself somewhere in him without his notice, the way seeds sometimes do. What neither man knew was that a car had parked quietly across the street 10 minutes earlier, and that Walt Higgins sat behind the wheel watching the entire exchange through the windshield, with his cane resting across his lap, his breath fogging faintly against the cold glass. Walt had followed Elijah every night for the past week, not out of the old suspicion that had driven him in the first days of this experiment, but out of something closer to protective habit, a promise he'd made to himself decades ago, that he would never again let Elijah face the world's cruelty entirely alone if he could help it. He had come tonight expecting, if he was honest with himself, to eventually catch his old friend performing kindness for an audience that didn't exist, the quiet cynicism of a man who had spent 30 years watching wealthy people mistake charity for character. Instead, he watched Elijah help a stranger who would never know his real name, who would never connect this gray-coated man on a cold sidewalk to the chairman of Boone's table, who would receive nothing from the exchange except medicine he desperately needed, and a few minutes of being treated like he still mattered to somebody. For the first time in 3 weeks, Walt did not feel like he was watching a stunt. He felt like he was watching finally who his oldest friend actually was underneath everything. The company, the money, and 31 years of carefully constructed distance had built on top of him. The same boy Robert Bishop had once wrapped in his own coat on a freezing sidewalk, still trying all these years later to be worth the saving. "God help me," Walt muttered to the empty car, wiping at his eyes with the back of one weathered hand. "I think this is real." Paige had never much liked being the sister people forgot to worry about. It was not a cruelty she had chosen, exactly, more a groove, worn into her over 6 years of watching every ounce of the family's attention pour into her older sister, who worked, who sacrificed, who had become, without ever asking for, roll the load-bearing wall of a household that might otherwise have collapsed entirely after their father's death. Paige had been 11 when Robert Bishop died. She had grieved too, in her own quiet, overlooked way. But grief in that house had always seemed to belong first and loudest to Nora and Paige, had learned early that there was rarely room left over for a second person's pain, once the first person's had filled every available space. So when she found the folded napkin in the pocket of Nora's coat, a phone number scrawled across it in unfamiliar handwriting beneath a single word, Eli, something small and resentful sparked in her before she had fully decided to act on it. She told herself it was concern. She told herself, scrolling through her phone that evening, that she was only protecting her family from a man who had no home, no job, no history. Anyone could verify a stranger who had already cost her sister $4,000, and if Trent Ashford's family connections were any indication, was standing squarely between the Bishops and a chance at real security for the first time since their father died. She did not fully examine the resentment underneath the concern, the small, ugly voice that whispered, maybe if Nora doesn't have him, she'll finally have room to pay attention to someone else for once. It took less than 10 minutes. She downloaded an app she had installed months earlier, under the guise of family safety, the kind of software that lived quietly in the background of a shared family phone plan, gave herself administrator access, and blocked the unfamiliar number entirely from Nora's contacts before deleting the napkin and returning the coat to its hook by the door exactly as she'd found it. By the time Nora noticed her phone had gone unusually quiet, 3 days had passed. "Have you seen Eli?" she asked Sampson at the diner on the 4th morning, scanning the alley out of habit before she'd even clocked in. "He hasn't come by. I'm starting to worry something happened to him." Sampson, recently promoted to assistant manager through a recommendation that had arrived conveniently from someone connected to the Ashford family. The same week Trent had first walked through the diner's front door, barely looked up from the register. "Haven't seen him. Maybe he moved on to easier pickings somewhere else." That's usually how it goes with guys like that. Nora did not believe him, not entirely, but 3 days of silence, and a phone that refused to ring had begun slowly to chip away at her certainty. What she did not know, what Sampson had no intention of telling her, was that Eli had in fact come by 3 separate times that week, each time arriving just before the morning rush, only to be met by Sampson blocking the alley door with his own body, arms crossed. Voice pitched low enough that the regular customers up front never heard a word of it. "She's not out here anymore." Sampson had told him the first time, not entirely a lie, since Nora's morning shift had shifted by an hour that week to cover for a coworker. Moved on to bigger things. "You should do the same." The second time Sampson had been more direct. "She's seeing someone now. A real someone. Somebody with a future. You need to stop coming around here before I call the police and tell them you've been harassing the staff. The third time standing in the same alley where Nora had once knelt to press a warm bowl into his cold hands. Elijah Boone had absorbed the words without argument, without protest. The old practiced instinct of 31 years telling him not to make a scene, not to take up more space than the world seemed willing to grant him even now. Even after everything he had learned in the last 2 weeks about who he actually was and where he actually came from, he had walked away in silence. But something had shifted in him since the night Walt showed him the photograph. The old Elijah, the frightened, careful boy who had learned to disappear quietly rather than risk being turned away, might have accepted Samson's word as final, might have simply let the door close and told himself it was for the best. This Elijah, who now understood exactly what it had cost, a 19-year-old line cook, to run out into the cold instead of staying safely behind a locked diner door, found that he could not make himself walk away from Nora Bishop quite so easily a second time. He called Walt the moment he was back within reach of a working phone. "I need you to find out what's happening to that family," Elijah said, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks, carrying a new note of resolve. Walt had not heard from him since before the shelter, years since before either of them had learned how much safer it felt to want nothing at all than to want something and lose it. All of it, Walt. Every debt, every deal, every person circling them right now. There's a man named Trent Ashford who's been showing up at that house with flowers and a smile that doesn't reach his eyes, and I want to know exactly what he wants from that family before this goes any further. "You think he's after something," Walt said. It wasn't a question. "A man that flashy doesn't fall in love with a diner waitress by accident," Elijah said. "Not when his family's name is attached to half the loan officers in this city. I want to know what he's really after before he gets close enough to take it." That evening, alone in her small bedroom with the lights off and the phone still stubbornly silent on her nightstand, Nora allowed herself for the first time in 3 days to cry, not the loud, cathartic tears of a single devastating moment, but the slow, exhausting kind that comes from a wound reopening. On top of an older one, the particular grief of losing someone twice, once when her father died behind his own counter, and now it seemed a second time, in a man who had walked into her life quietly enough that she had not even realized how much space he'd already taken up in it, until the space went silent. She thought of the framed envelope she imagined he must still have somewhere if he'd kept it at all, and wondered if she had been foolish, if Samson's dismissive words carried more truth than she wanted to admit, if a man with nothing to his name really could simply vanish the moment. Something easier came along. Downstairs, unheard, Diane sat at the kitchen table reading a glossy brochure. Trent Ashford had left behind, admiring the photographs of a lakeside property 20 minutes outside the city, already in the quiet privacy of her own hopeful heart, imagining a version of her daughter's future, secure, enough that she would never again have to watch someone she loved go without. And 2 floors below the diner where Nora worked, in a modest walk-up apartment on the edge of downtown Preston, Ashford sat across from his son at a small kitchen table, a folder of old bank records spread out between them, discussing in low, careful tones exactly how much longer it would take before the deed to a certain building on 9th Street could be legally quietly reclaimed, provided, of course, that his son's engagement proceeded according to plan, and that nothing and no one was left standing in the way. It took 4 days. Walt Higgins had not moved through the world at speed in a very long time, not since the accident that had left him with the cane and the particular ache in his hip that flared whenever weather turned, and certainly not since age had begun to catch up with a body that had already given a great deal, on Elijah's behalf, over 30 years of quiet, unglamorous loyalty. But those 4 days, Walt worked with an urgency that surprised even himself, driven less by curiosity now than by something closer to dread. The growing uncomfortable certainty that whatever he was about to uncover would not simply confirm a suspicion, but detonate one. He started with the public record bank filings, business licenses, the ordinary paper trail any registered company leaves behind. From there he moved to less public sources, a retired county clerk who owed him a favor from decades earlier, an old newspaper archive housed in a basement that smelled of mildew and forgotten decades, and finally on the third night a diner booth across from a retired loan officer named Harold Vance, who agreed to talk only after Walt had bought him 2 cups of coffee and promised several times that none of it would ever be traced back to him. Robert Bishop, Harold said, turning his coffee cup slowly between weathered hands, was the cleanest borrower I ever processed in 30 years at that bank. 15 years, not a single missed payment, not one late fee. Man built his whole life around never owing anybody anything he couldn't account for. He shook his head slowly, the particular disgust of a man who had spent his whole career inside a system and had near the end of it finally allowed himself to see it clearly. And then, out of nowhere, his loan got called in. 11 days before it was even due. No warning letter, no grace period, nothing that would have been extended to any other client with a record like his. Who ordered it? Walt asked, though some part of him had already guessed the shape of the answer before Harold said the name out loud. Preston Ashford. Harold set down his cup. He wasn't even supposed to have authority over that account. It was outside his usual portfolio entirely. He pulled rank, called in a favor from someone higher up, and pushed it through in less than a week. I always wondered why. Man like that doesn't waste his own political capital calling in a loan on some small diner unless there's something in it for him. By the fourth night, Walt had the rest of it laid out across Elijah's coffee table like pieces of a puzzle finally arranged into the shape neither of them wanted to see. Elijah, Walt said, sliding the final stack of papers across the table, his hand not quite steady. Robert Bishop's diner didn't fail because of bad business. It failed because Preston Ashford deliberately called in a clean loan 11 days early with no warning from a family with 15 years of spotless payment history. That's not an oversight. That's a targeted decision. Elijah's jaw tightened as he scanned the documents. Why would a man like Ashford care about one small diner? Because of what came next. Walt pulled a second document free, an auction record. The ink faded, but the numbers still perfectly legible. The building went up for public auction less than a month after the bankruptcy. Preston Ashford showed up in person bidding through a shell company under a different name. He very nearly won it. Your father's company, through the same Meridian Holdings acquisition we already found, outbid him by a narrow margin, less than 6 hours before the auction closed. Elijah looked up sharply. My father beat him to it. By hours, Elijah. Ashford has spent 6 years since then trying to figure out how to get that land back into his family's hands. And now his son is engaged to marry into the one family that still legally holds the deed. Walt's voice dropped lower, heavier. This was never a coincidence. Trent Ashford didn't fall in love with a diner waitress by accident. He was sent. Something cold settled behind Elijah's eyes. Not the raw, unguarded grief that had overtaken him the night Walt showed him the photograph of his mother's final hour, but something sharper, more focused, the particular clarity of a man who has finally identified the shape of a threat he'd only sensed circling in the dark. This was never about Nora, Elijah said quietly. It was never about love or family or any of the things Diane Bishop is hoping for at that kitchen table every night. It's about a piece of land on 9th Street, the exact corner where my mother died, the exact corner where a bishop tried and failed to save her, and then quietly rebuilt a life on top of that failure for 30 years before losing it to the very family, now trying to finish the job by other means. Walt was quiet for a long moment, watching his old friend absorb the full shape of what they had uncovered, not just the financial scheme ugly as it was, but the deeper, crueler irony sitting underneath it, that the same corner where an act of desperate failed kindness had once occurred was now 3 decades later being fought over by 2 families who had no idea how deeply, how impossibly their histories were already entangled. There's more, Walt said finally, his voice dropping to something barely audible. I wasn't going to tell you tonight. I wanted you to have at least one evening to sit with what we already know before I gave you the rest of it. Tell me anyway, Elijah said. Walt hesitated, his hand resting flat against the last unopened folder in the stack, the one he had deliberately set aside. The one he had reread 3 times in the parking lot outside before he'd found the nerve to bring it upstairs at all. Not tonight, Walt said, and for the first time in the entire investigation, something in his voice sounded less like caution and more like fear, not for Elijah's safety this time, but for what the next revelation might cost them, both. Give me until tomorrow. There's something in here about Robert Bishop's final weeks that I need to verify before I put it in front of you. I don't want to hand you something this heavy on a guess. Elijah studied his oldest friend for a long moment, the tired lines around his eyes that had deepened visibly over the last 4 days, the particular grayness that had crept into his color that Elijah had until this moment attributed entirely to exhaustion and the late nights of research. Walt, Elijah said slowly, something shifting in his expression, a new and different worry beginning to surface beneath the anger at Ashford. Are you all right? I'm fine, Walt said too quickly, gathering the folders back into a neat stack and rising from the table with more effort than the motion should have required. Just tired. It's been a long few days. He left without saying anything more, his cane tapping an uneven rhythm down the hallway toward the elevator, and Elijah sat alone in the quiet of the penthouse for a long time afterward, staring at the closed folder Walt had refused to open, a new unease settling over him that had nothing to do with Preston Ashford or the deed to a building on Ninth Street at all. Something was wrong. He had known Walt Higgins for 30 years, had watched him move through triumph and grief and every ordinary day in between, and he recognized with the particular clarity of long familiarity that the tremor in his oldest friend's hands tonight had not come only from exhaustion, and that whatever Walt was still deciding how to say out loud, it was going to change something between them far more permanently than any bank record ever could. Walt did not come the next morning as promised. Elijah waited until noon, then called, and when the call rang through to voicemail 4 times in a row, something cold and unfamiliar moved through his chest, a fear that had nothing to do with bank records or shell companies and everything to have and do with the tremor he had watched pass through his oldest friend's hands the night before. Walt finally called back a little after 2, his voice rough, apologetic in a way that did not entirely mask something else underneath it. "I'm fine, Elijah. Overslept. Give me an hour." He arrived just past 3, moving more slowly than usual, lowering himself into the chair across from Elijah, with a care that had become over the last week quietly impossible to ignore. He set the last folder on the table between them, the one he had refused to open the night before, and this time he did not hesitate. "I verified it this morning," Walt said. "Twice. I wanted to be certain before I said any of this to you." He opened the folder. Inside was a copy of a death certificate, the official cause of death, listed in the clean clinical language. Such documents always use acute myocardial infarction, and beneath it a stack of secondary documents Walt had spent the entire previous night and half the morning assembling bank correspondence, auction records, and near the bottom, a handwritten timeline in Walt's own careful script. "Robert Bishop didn't just lose his business," Elijah Walt said quietly. "The loan was called in on a Tuesday. The auction for the building happened 11 days later. 2 weeks after that, 14 days, almost to the hour, Robert had a heart attack behind the counter of what used to be his own diner, the same counter he'd stood behind for 15 years in a building that no longer legally belonged to him. He collapsed alone. A delivery driver found him 20 minutes later. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing left to do." Elijah stared at the timeline, the dates arranged with brutal, undeniable clarity: loan call, auction, collapse, death, each event stacked against the next, in a sequence too tight, too deliberate looking to be coincidence. "The death certificate says natural causes," Walt continued, "and medically, that's not wrong. His heart simply gave out. But Elijah, I talked to his cardiologist's old office this morning. Robert had a mild heart condition for years, well managed, nothing that should have killed a man his age under ordinary circumstances. His doctor told him repeatedly to reduce stress. 15 years of running that diner never once threatened his heart the way 11 days of watching it get taken from him did." Something in Elijah's face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man standing at the edge of a realization he does not yet want to fully step into. "Preston Ashford didn't put a hand on him," Elijah said slowly, testing the shape of the thought as it formed. "There's no crime in a bank calling in a loan. No court in this country would ever call what happened to Robert Bishop murder." "No," Walt agreed. "But he knew exactly what he was doing when he did it. A man with Preston Ashford's experience in banking knows precisely how much stress a call like that puts on a person, especially a man already managing a heart condition his own bank's records almost certainly had on file from his loan application. He didn't pull a trigger, Elijah, but he built the gun, loaded it, and pointed it at a man he'd never even met, purely because there was a piece of land underneath that man's diner worth more to Preston Ashford than the life sitting on top of it." Elijah rose from the table and walked to the window, staring out at a city that had 31 years earlier let his own mother die on a sidewalk from neglect, that likewise carried no legal name, no prosecutable crime, only the quiet, devastating cruelty of a system built to look away from people who did not have enough money to make themselves impossible to ignore. "He killed the one man who ever tried to save my mother," Elijah said, his voice very quiet, very controlled, the particular control of a man holding something enormous behind a thin and carefully maintained wall. "And now he's dressed his own son up to finish the job, not with a bank record this time, but with a marriage. Taking the daughter the same way he took the father's life. Legally, cleanly, with flowers and a smile that doesn't reach his eyes." Walt did not answer right away. He sat with his hands folded on the table, watching his oldest friend's back, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something Elijah had not heard from him in all 30 years of their friendship. Not worry, not caution, but a kind of fierce, unguarded conviction. I spent 3 weeks telling you this whole thing was reckless, Walt said. Following you around this city, half convinced you were about to get robbed or hurt, or worse, by some stranger on a street corner who had nothing left to lose. I thought the danger in all of this was you walking around unprotected in a coat that couldn't keep out the cold. I was wrong. The whole time, the real danger to that family was never the man behind the dumpster. It was the man in the pressed suit and the expensive car, the one they welcomed into their living room with flowers and coffee and their best chairs. Elijah turned from the window. In the fading afternoon light, Walt looked older than Elijah had ever quite let himself notice before the grayness in his color, the careful way he held himself as though certain movements now cost him something he was reluctant to name. Walt, Elijah said, the anger toward Ashford momentarily giving way to something more immediate. What haven't you told me? Last night, this morning, something else is going on with you, and it's not just exhaustion from 4 days of digging through old files. I've known you 30 years. I know what tired looks like on you. This isn't that. Walt was quiet for a long moment, his hands still folded on the table, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that had nothing to do with the room they were sitting in. Not today, Walt said finally, gathering the folder back together with hands that trembled just slightly at the edges. Today we finish this. We get Preston Ashford's crimes in front of people who can actually hold him accountable for them, and we make sure that family never has to live one more day under the shadow of what he did to them. Whatever else there is to say between us, Elijah, it can wait until Nora Bishop is safe. That's the only thing that matters right now. He rose from the table, steadying himself with his cane, and paused at the door before letting himself out the way he had paused at that same door once before, a week earlier on the night he'd first shown Elijah the photograph that changed everything. Elijah, Walt said, not quite turning around. For what it's worth, 31 years ago, a 19-year-old boy ran outside into the cold because he couldn't stand the thought of walking past someone who needed him. I think that's the only inheritance that's ever really mattered in this whole story. Not the money, not the deed to that building, just that the choice to run outside instead of staying warm behind a locked door. I think it's time we both remembered that's still who we're supposed to be, no matter what it costs us to prove it. The door clicked shut behind him, and Elijah stood alone in the quiet of the penthouse, the last of the afternoon light fading from the window, the weight of everything he had learned in the past 10 days settling over him like a second coat, heavier now. But somehow, for the first time in 31 years, no longer something he had to carry entirely alone. Elijah noticed it 3 days later in the particular way a person finally sees something they have been quietly refusing to look at directly for weeks. They were in the Boone's table offices reviewing the last of the evidence Walt had compiled: bank records, the auction bids, the timeline of Robert Bishop's final 2 weeks laid out now in a clean, damning row across the conference table. When Walt reached for the coffee, an assistant had set in front of him, took one sip and set it back down without finishing it. A small thing. The kind of thing a person might not notice at all, except that Elijah had watched Walt drink black coffee, 2 cups minimum every single morning of their friendship for 30 years. The way some men keep a wedding ring on out of habit long after the marriage that gave it meaning has ended. He noticed, too, the way Walt had begun sitting down between errands lately, not out of laziness, which had never once described his oldest friend, but with the careful, deliberate pacing of a man conserving something he no longer had in abundant supply. He noticed the color that came and went from Walt's face at odd moments, the way it had that morning, sudden and troubling, before settling back into something closer to normal a few minutes later. He noticed that Walt had stopped climbing the stairs to the mezzanine level of the office, a habit he'd kept for years out of stubborn pride in refusing the elevator, and had not offered a single explanation for the change. Walt, Elijah said, closing the folder in front of him and setting it aside. How long have you been sick? The question landed in the quiet room like something dropped from a height. Walt did not answer right away. He looked instead at his own hands folded on the table, the same hands that had held Elijah's shoulder at his father's funeral, that had signed 1,000 ordinary documents over 30 years of quiet, faithful service to a company, and a friendship that had never once asked him to explain himself. Close the door, Walt said finally. Elijah rose and closed it, then sat back down across from his oldest friend, his heart already beginning to climb toward his throat, in a way he recognized from exactly one other moment in his life, the moment, 31 years earlier, when a stranger's hands had gone cold in his own on a frozen sidewalk, and some part of him had understood, even at 5 years old, that the world was about to rearrange itself into something he was not prepared for. 8 months, Walt said quietly. 8 months. Elijah's voice cracked on the word disbelief, and something sharper, something closer to betrayal rising underneath it. Walt, you've been chasing bank records at midnight, sitting outside missions in a cold car until 2 in the morning to make sure nobody hurt me while I was out there in that coat. You've been doing all of that for 8 months and you didn't think to say a single word to me. I didn't want you to know, Walt said. Not yet. Maybe not ever if I could have managed it. Why? Walt looked up, and for the first time in 30 years, Elijah saw something in his oldest friend's eyes that he had never once seen there before. Not fear exactly, though fear was somewhere underneath it, but something closer to a kind of fierce, exhausted determination. The look of a man who has made peace with a great deal more than he has let on. Because you needed someone in your corner who wasn't going to fall apart, Walt said. You were out there testing an entire city, tearing open 31 years of grief you'd never let yourself feel, finding out your own father spent his last years quietly protecting a family neither of you ever met, and somewhere in the middle of all that I found out my own body had a timeline attached to it that I didn't much care for. I had a choice, Elijah. I could spend whatever time I had left sitting in waiting rooms feeling sorry for myself, or I could spend it doing the one thing I've always been good at, which is standing next to you and making sure the world doesn't get away with hurting you when I can help it. Walt, I've spent my whole life being the person other people worry about. Walt continued, his voice steady now. The words clearly ones he had rehearsed alone late at night more than once. Bad hip, slow on the stairs. The friend everybody's careful with without ever quite saying so out loud. I wanted just once, just this once, before whatever time I have left runs out, to be the person who showed up anyway. Not the one people protected. The one who did the protecting. Elijah sat very still, the folder of evidence against Preston Ashford, forgotten entirely on the table between them. 31 years of friendship rearranging itself in his chest, into a shape he had never once let himself consider, the steady, unglamorous presence he had relied on his entire and adult life. The man who had appeared at every difficult moment with a cane and a folder and an unshakable practical calm had been quietly carrying something enormous the entire time, and had chosen deliberately not to set it down where Elijah might see it and be distracted from his own healing. You should have told me, Elijah said finally, his voice thick. Not because I would have stopped you, because you shouldn't have had to carry that alone. Not after everything you've never once let me carry alone. I know, Walt said softer now. I'm telling you now. Why now? Walt allowed himself for the first time in the conversation something close to a smile, tired but genuine, the particular warmth of a man who has decided after a great deal of private deliberation exactly what he still wants from whatever time remains to him. Because we're close to the end of this, Elijah. Ashford's crimes are laid out clean enough now that even a courtroom that's never once looked twice at a man like Robert Bishop is going to have to pay attention. And I want to see you get your family back, really get it back all the way to the end before anything else happens to me. That's not a request. Consider it the last order I'm giving you as your Director of Community Relations. Elijah reached across the table and gripped his old friend's forearm, the same gesture Walt had offered him 100 times over 30 years of friendship, the roles quietly, permanently reversed. You're not going anywhere until you've walked me down that aisle, if it comes to that, Elijah said, his voice rough. You hear me. Whatever timeline the doctors gave you, I don't accept it as final. We're going to fight this the same way we've fought everything else. Together. No more secrets. No more carrying things alone because you've decided I'm too fragile to help carry them. Deal, Walt said quietly, and for a long moment neither man said anything else at all. The late afternoon light slanting gold and low through the office windows, 31 years of friendship settling into a new and more honest shape. Between them, one built at last, not on the careful management who was allowed to be strong and who was allowed to need help, but on the plain, unguarded truth that they had all along needed each other in equal measure. Let's finish it right then, Walt said, finally straightening in his chair with visible effort, reaching for the folder again with hands that no longer trembled quite so badly. I want to see you get your family back before anything else happens to either of us. Ashford's had this coming for 31 years. Let's make sure he doesn't get one more day of pretending otherwise. The video reached Diane Bishop's phone before Nora ever saw it herself. It had been filmed by a neighbor, 2 doors down, a woman named Carol Danvers, who fancied herself something of a local commentator phone, always ready, always hunting for the next small drama to narrate to her several thousand followers. She had caught quite by accident the moment Samson Reed shoved a disheveled man away from the diner's side entrance a week earlier, laughing the entire time for the benefit of the camera. The caption beneath it reading in bright, mocking letters, "Some people really will do anything for attention, lol. Meet Nora Bishop's boyfriend." By the time it reached Diane's phone, it had accumulated tens of thousands of views. The comments beneath it were not kind. Nora, Diane's voice carried up the stairs with a sharpness that made Nora's stomach drop before she'd even reached the landing. "Get down here. Now." Paige was already in the living room when Nora arrived. The video paused on the television screen. Elijah's gaunt, frightened face frozen mid-flinch in high definition for the whole family to examine. A cold, sick feeling spread through Nora's chest at the sight of him, thinner than she remembered. His eyes hollow in a way the alley's dim lighting had never fully revealed. "This is who you chose," Paige said, arms crossed, though something uncertain flickered beneath her bravado, a discomfort she didn't examine too closely. "Over Trent Ashford. A viral joke, Nora. Everyone at school has seen this." "You don't know him," Nora said, her voice shaking. "None of you know the first thing about him." "We know enough." Diane snapped, and there were tears standing in her eyes now, tears of exhaustion and fear rather than cruelty, though the words landed just as hard either way. "Trent is coming Friday, Nora. He is going to ask you a question in front of this family, and you are going to sit there and act like a daughter who still has some sense left in her, because I cannot watch you throw away a chance at a real life for a man who can't even keep himself fed." Nora said nothing. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, argued, cried over in the 6 days since her phone had gone silent, and Eli had simply inexplicably disappeared from the corner where she'd fed him every morning for 3 weeks. She did not yet know about Samson's lies. She did not yet know that the silence had never been Eli's choice at all. She knew only the ache of it, the particular grief of loving someone who seemed in the end to have vanished without a word, exactly as everyone had warned her he would. Friday arrived cold and clear, the kind of bright winter afternoon that seems cruelly entirely unaware of the weight settling over the people beneath it. Trent arrived precisely on time, dressed in a charcoal suit, carrying a small velvet box that Diane spotted from the window before he'd even reached the porch steps. She let out a small, involuntary sound relief, hope 6 years of quiet desperation finally she believed about to be rewarded. "Nora, sweetheart," Diane whispered, gripping her daughter's hand in the front hallway before the door opened. Please just give this a chance. For this family." Trent was as always effortlessly charming through the appetizers, through the careful small talk, through Diane's visibly trembling attempts at composure, and Paige's badly disguised excitement filming small clips for her followers. Between courses. It was only when the dessert plates had been cleared that he rose from his chair, straightened his jacket, and lowered himself onto one knee beside Nora's chair, the velvet box already open in his palm, the diamond inside catching the dining room light with theatrical precision. "Nora Bishop," Trent said, his voice pitched for the room rather than for her. "I don't like waiting for what I want. I've known that about myself since I was young, and I want you. I can give you everything you've never had: security, comfort, a life where you never have to scrape together a savings account $4 at a time again. Marry me." Diane had already begun crying. Paige had lifted her phone. The whole room seemed to lean forward, waiting, the silence stretching taut as a wire. Nora looked down at the ring, then at her mother's face, hopeful, exhausted, 6 years of grief and fear, compressed into a single desperate expression, and felt something in her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with the cleat diamond in front of her at all. "I can't," she whispered. Diane's voice broke. "I can't, Mom." Nora rose from her chair, her own voice steadier now, though tears had begun sliding freely down her face. "My heart is somewhere else. It has been the whole time, even after he disappeared, even after everyone told me I was a fool for believing in a man who had nothing. I can't marry someone because it would make things easier for this family. Dad wouldn't have wanted that for me. He wouldn't have wanted me to trade what he taught me for a bank account." "Your heart," Diane said, her voice thin with grief, "and fear as a child who doesn't understand what it takes to keep a family fed. Love wasn't enough to keep your father alive behind that counter, Nora. I buried a good man and years of debt along with him. I will not stand here and watch you choose that same road with your eyes wide open." The room had gone entirely silent. Trent still kneeling the ring, beginning to feel even to him like a prop in a play that had suddenly veered off script. "Then I'll walk it with my eyes open," Nora said quietly, "the same way Dad did. Because at least it will be mine." She left the dining room before anyone could stop her out into the cold evening air, walking without any real destination. Only the desperate need for space enough to breathe, unaware that 4 blocks away in a modest apartment above a hardware store, Elijah Boone and Walt Higgins sat over the last of the evidence against Preston Ashford, finally fully assembled, and that within days, everything about to unravel in that dining room would unravel a second time, far more publicly, and far more permanently. Behind her in the dining room, Trent Ashford rose slowly from his knee, closing the velvet box with a soft, deliberate click. his charming smile flickering for just a moment into something colder, more calculating before he caught himself and turned it back on for Diane's benefit. "She'll come around," he said smoothly, though something in his voice had hardened. "Give her time. Some people just need a little more convincing than others." Paige, phone still in hand, lowered it slowly. The excitement she had felt only minutes earlier, giving way for the first time to something uneasy. A small, unfamiliar doubt about the man she had spent the last month admiring from the staircase, and about exactly what kind of convincing he had in mind. The Boone's Table Founders Gala had for 11 consecutive years been held in the grand ballroom of the Indianapolis Hyatt Regency, an evening of black ties and champagne towers meant to celebrate the quiet, unassuming empire Elijah's father had built, one lunch counter at a time. 300 of the city's wealthiest names filled the room that night, along with a scattering of investors flown in from Chicago and New York, all of them murmuring in careful undertones about the chairman's mysterious 3-week absence, and whether it signaled something troubling for the company's future. Nobody in that ballroom expected the doors to open the way they did. Elijah Boone walked through the grand entrance, still wearing the gray coat, the same one he had worn for 21 days on street corners, and behind dumpsters the collar frayed, the hem still faintly stained with slush from 100 cold mornings. Beside him, moving slowly but with his chin lifted, Walt Higgins kept pace, his cane striking the marble floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm, his tuxedo the only concession either man had made to the evening's dress code. "Sir, I'm going to need to see an invitation," a security guard began, stepping forward with a hand raised. "He's the chairman," Walt said, his voice carrying further than his frail frame seemed capable of producing. "And I've spent 30 years making sure he never forgot who he was underneath the suits everybody keeps trying to put him back into. I wasn't about to miss this for anything, and neither was he." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd, as recognition dawned, faces turning, phones lifting, the low murmur of 300 conversations collapsing into a single stunned silence. As Elijah crossed the ballroom floor toward the small, raised stage at its center, still in the same coat that had made him invisible to half this city for 3 weeks running. Diane Bishop, seated near the front at a table Trent Ashford had arranged, went pale. Trent's easy smile faltered for the first time all evening. Near the bar, Preston Ashford set down his glass with unhurried precision, though something tight had entered the line of his shoulders. "Most of you know me," Elijah began, his voice steady despite the tremor Walt alone could see in his hands, "as the man who inherited Boone's Table from my father. What you don't know is that 31 years ago, on a corner 2 blocks from where I'm standing tonight, my mother collapsed on a sidewalk in the cold with nowhere left to go and nothing left to give either of us. She died there. I was 5 years old. The room had gone entirely, absolutely silent. A 19-year-old line cook was the only person in this entire city who ran outside to try to save her," Elijah continued. "He held me afterward on that sidewalk in his own coat until someone came to take me somewhere warm. He never told anyone what happened that night. Not his wife, not even his own daughters. But my father found out somehow years later and quietly spent the rest of his life protecting that man's family without ever once telling me why. I only learned the truth 2 weeks ago, after I spent 21 days finding out whether this city still had anyone left in it who would treat a stranger like a human being instead of a wallet." He turned, finding Nora's face in the crowd. She had come with her mother, seated stiffly beside Trent, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and a hope she did not yet dare to trust. "I found her," Elijah said, his voice softening. "Her name is Nora Bishop. Her father was that line cook. And every single morning for 3 weeks, without knowing a single thing about who I really was, she fed a stranger out of her own tip money, because her father taught her to give her hand first and ask questions later. She inherited that heart from a man this city let die twice, once on a frozen sidewalk 31 years ago, watching a woman he couldn't save, and once 6 years ago, behind his own counter after a man in this room deliberately destroyed everything he'd built." He turned toward the bar where Preston Ashford stood, very still, his face gone, the particular gray of a man watching the floor open beneath him in real time. Preston Ashford called in Robert Bishop's business loan 11 days early, with no warning, after 15 years of a spotless payment record, a decision that drove that family into bankruptcy and directly contributed to the heart attack that killed him 2 weeks later. When his attempt to seize the property at auction failed, he waited 6 years and sent his son to finish the job a different way by marrying into the family and reclaiming the deed through the courts instead. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to open disbelief, 300 faces swiveling between the chairman on the stage and the Ashfords frozen at their table. "I have the loan records," Elijah said. "The auction bids. the medical timeline. And as of this morning, so does the FBI. 2 agents in dark suits stepped forward from the ballroom's rear entrance, moving with the calm, unhurried authority of people who had been waiting for exactly this cue. Preston Ashford did not run. There was quite simply nowhere left for him to go, and something in his face suggested he had known on some level that this reckoning had always been coming, merely later than he'd hoped, and far more publicly than he'd feared. Trent rose from his chair, his composure cracking for the first time all evening. "This is insane. This is a stunt, It's evidence," Mr. Ashford, one of the agents, said quietly, already moving toward the table. Elijah stepped down from the stage and crossed the ballroom floor, ignoring the flashing phones, the whispered names, the particular electric hum of 300 people witnessing something they would talk about for years. He stopped in front of Nora, who had risen slowly from her chair, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears already sliding silently down her face. "I told you my name was Eli," Elijah said quietly, close enough now that only she could hear him clearly over the chaos still unfolding behind them. "That part was never a lie. Everything else, the coat, the alley, the hunger I put on for reasons I didn't fully understand myself until 2 weeks ago. But what I felt every morning eating oatmeal you paid for with your own tip money, standing on the exact spot where your father once held a dying woman and her son and refused to let go of either of them, none of that was ever a performance, Nora. That was the realest thing that's happened to me in 31 years. Nora stared at him, the gray coat, the hollow face she'd fed for 3 weeks, now standing in front of her, attached to a name she had heard on the news her entire adult life, Boone's Table, the chain her own father had once looked to for inspiration in the years before his diner failed. "You're him," she whispered. "You're Elijah Boone." "I'm Eli," he said softly. "I've just been him the whole time too. I was hoping somewhere along the way you might be able to love both." Behind them, security escorted Preston and Trent Ashford from the ballroom in handcuffs, the room's stunned silence finally breaking into a rising wave of murmurs. But for Nora Bishop, standing frozen in the middle of it all with tears on her face and her father's name spoken aloud by a stranger who had just revealed himself to be so much more, the noise of the entire room seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the quiet, impossible truth standing directly in front of her. The days following the gala moved with the strange, disorienting speed of a life being quietly rebuilt from the inside out. News vans camped outside the Boone's Table headquarters for the better part of a week, chasing a story that had almost overnight become the kind of tale local anchors leaned into with visible enthusiasm. The reclusive billionaire, chairman, the disguise, the decades-old tragedy, the fraud, finally exposed on live camera in front of 300 witnesses. Elijah gave a single brief statement to the press and declined every interview request that followed. The cameras, he had learned long ago, were rarely interested in the quieter work that actually mattered. So he did that work anyway, away from the lenses in the ordinary daylight hours when nobody was watching at all. The deed transfer went through 3 days after the gala, quiet, unceremonious, exactly the way Elijah wanted it. The building at 9th Street and the small plot of land beneath it were signed over entirely into Nora Bishop's name. Free and clear, no strings attached, no company logo stamped anywhere on the paperwork, no press release announcing Boone's Table's generosity to the world. When Nora opened the envelope at her mother's kitchen table, she sat without moving for nearly 20 minutes, staring at her father's old address printed cleanly beneath her own name, her hands too unsteady at first to make sense of the rest of the pages inside. "He didn't have to do this," she whispered when Diane finally sat down beside her. "No," Diane agreed quietly. "He didn't." That Saturday, Elijah and Walt drove out to the building together, parking on the same stretch of curb where 31 years earlier, a young line cook had once run out into the cold. A contractor had already cleared the boarded windows and hauled away the worst of the debris inside, but the old Bishop's Kitchen sign still leaned against the brick exterior, chipped and faded, the lettering barely legible beneath years of grime. "You're really doing this yourself?" Walt asked, watching Elijah climb the ladder a crew had left propped against the storefront. "My father did it in secret for 6 years, Elijah said, hauling the restored sign up by its bracket, his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. "I think it's time somebody did it out in the open where the person it's actually for can see it happening." Walt held the ladder steady, wincing slightly as his hip protested the cold morning air, but he did not sit this one out. Together, the two of them worked through the better part of the afternoon, replacing bulbs, scrubbing 31 years of grime from the front windows, righting the old counter stools that had somehow survived, still stacked in a storage room waiting for someone to want them again. "You've got flour on your tie," Elijah said at one point, glancing over. "I've got flour on a tie that costs more than most people's first car." Walt said, entirely unbothered, dragging a rag across the last stubborn streak on the front glass. Feels about right, honestly. Some things ought to get their hands dirty once in a while. The following week, Elijah convened the Boone's table board for the first time since his return, not to explain himself, though several members had clearly arrived, expecting exactly that, but to announce two decisions he had already made, and did not intend to put up for debate. The first was Walt's promotion to Vice President of Community Development, a title that finally matched in weight and authority the 3 decades of quiet service Walt had given the company and the family behind it, without ever once asking for recognition. The second was the establishment of a permanent charitable fund, the Ruth Boone Fund, named for the mother Elijah had spent 31 years unable to speak of, at all dedicated to feeding and housing families on the exact corner where she had once been left with nothing, and eventually expanding outward across every city where a Boone's Table storefront stood. "I want you to run it," Elijah told Walt afterward, alone in his office, the boardroom having emptied out behind them, still murmuring with surprise. "For as long as you're able. And beyond that, however long that turns out to be, I want you to help train whoever comes after you so it never becomes just another line item some accountant quietly trims in a bad quarter." Walt was quiet for a moment, his eyes bright. "I don't have forever left in me for this job," he said finally, his voice steadier than the words themselves. "But I've got enough left to see it started right. That's worth more to me than any title you could have handed me instead." Diane Bishop came to the diner 3 days after the sign went back up, standing in the doorway for a long moment before she could make herself step inside. She had spent 6 years grieving a husband whose quiet heroism she had never fully known, and grieving him again now differently, with the added weight of understanding at last exactly what he had carried silently through every one of the 15 years he'd stood behind that same counter. "I'd like to help," she told Elijah, when she finally found him in the back, going over paint samples with a contractor. "With the training program. The one about treating every customer like they might be the most important person you'll meet all year. I raised a daughter who already knew that lesson before she ever met you. I think now I understand a little better where she learned it. Your husband knew it 31 years before any of us did," Elijah said gently. "I'd be honored to have your help passing it on." Paige came a few mornings after that, unannounced, still visibly uncertain of her welcome. She had watched the gala unfold on someone else's phone at a friend's house, had sat through the following week in a fog of guilt. She did not yet know how to voice out loud the deleted contact, the blocked number, the 3 days of silence she had engineered without ever imagining the depth of what it had nearly cost her sister. She said nothing when she arrived. She simply picked up a rag from the counter and began wiping down tables, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed carefully on her own hands. Nora watched her for a long moment, then walked over and took up a rag of her own, working the next table in silence beside her sister. "I'm sorry," Paige finally said so quietly it nearly disappeared beneath the sound of the coffee machine. "For the phone. For all of it. I don't have a good excuse. I was jealous and I was scared, and I did something ugly because of it." "I know," Nora said. She did not say it easily, forgave it fully in that moment, but she said it and reached over to squeeze her sister's hand once before returning to her work, the two of them cleaning the same counter their father had once stood behind, side by side, the way sisters sometimes find their way back to each other, not all at once, but one small, unglamorous gesture at a time. Preston and Trent Ashford were indicted within the month on charges of financial fraud, predatory lending, and in a development that made national headlines, contributing to Robert Bishop's death through documented deliberate negligence. Ashford Financial collapsed under the weight of its own records less than 6 weeks later. Its assets seized, its name quietly stripped from 3 separate downtown buildings before winter's end. And on the corner of 9th Street, beneath a freshly painted sign that read simply "Bishop's Table," a small crowd gathered on opening day, Diane behind the register, Paige running food between tables, Walt seated near the window with his cane propped against the counter, watching Nora Bishop step behind her father's old counter, for the first time as its rightful owner, a woman finally fully standing on ground that had, in more ways than any of them could have imagined, always been waiting to be given back to her. The wedding was small, held on a bright, cold Saturday morning inside the newly restored Bishop's Table, exactly where Nora had asked for it to be. No grand ballroom, no towering floral arrangements flown in from out of state, only folding chairs, borrowed from the church 2 blocks over, string lights looped along the exposed brick, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting out from behind. The same counter where Robert Bishop had once stood for 15 years, and where his daughter now stood as the rightful owner of everything he had built and lost and in the end quietly reclaimed. A small brass plaque had been mounted by the front door only days earlier, its lettering simple and unadorned. No one turned away hungry. In memory of Robert Bishop and Ruth Boone, who found each other on this corner once and never let go of what it taught them. Walt Higgins stood as best man, thinner than he had been, even a few weeks earlier, leaning on his cane, but standing straighter than anyone in the room, his eyes bright with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, but some third thing that only a life spent loving someone quietly for 30 years could produce. 31 years ago, Walt said, lifting his glass when the toasts began, his voice carrying easily across the small hushed room. A woman died on this street because the world walked right past her. 3 weeks ago, I followed my oldest friend around this city, half convinced he was about to get himself hurt chasing some experiment I didn't understand. Turns out he was only trying to find out whether this city still had a heart left in it. Turns out it did. It was standing behind a diner counter the whole time, feeding him oatmeal, without knowing it was healing something that broke 31 years before she was even born. He paused, his hand trembling slightly around the glass. I don't know how much more time I get to stand next to this man, Walt said, his voice dropping lower, rougher. But I know I got to stand here tonight and watch him become whole. That's worth more to me than any boardroom I ever sat in, any deal I ever helped close. That's the only inheritance that ever really mattered. Elijah rose and took Nora's hand. His own eyes wet, the whole room fading around the two of them into something smaller and quieter than the celebration surrounding it. I spent my whole life believing I lost my mother on a sidewalk with nothing, he said. I never let myself believe I could be found again the same way by someone with nothing to give but everything to offer anyway. You didn't just feed a hungry man, Nora. You healed a wound I didn't even know I was still carrying. That's not something money could ever buy, and it's not something I will ever stop being grateful for as long as I live. I'd do it again, Nora said, tears sliding freely down her face. Every single day. I didn't know what I was healing. I just did what my father taught me. He taught you well, Elijah said softly. He taught both of us in the end. Just 31 years apart. If there is one thing this story leaves behind long after the coat comes off and the cameras stop flashing, it is this: some wounds are too deep for money to ever fully reach on its own, and some small kindnesses are too quiet to notice at the time until years later they turn out to have saved someone's life, not once but twice. Robert Bishop never told anyone what happened on that sidewalk 31 years earlier. He simply carried it quietly the rest of his life and raised a daughter who inherited his instinct without ever knowing where it came from. That is often how the deepest lessons pass from one generation to the next, not through grand speeches but through the small, repeated choice to give your hand first and ask questions later, even when giving costs you something you cannot easily spare. Elijah Boone had everything money could buy, and still for 31 years he carried a hunger. No amount of wealth could satisfy the hunger to know that he mattered to someone for reasons that had nothing to do with what he could offer them. It took a stranger with nothing but a bowl of oatmeal and an open heart to finally answer that hunger in a place he never could have guessed was already written into his own history. And Walt Higgins' steady, unglamorous, endlessly overlooked Walt reminds us that some of the strongest love in our lives rarely announces itself. It simply shows up again and again in a cold car outside a mission at 2 a.m, in a folder of evidence assembled through sleepless nights, in a friendship that asks for nothing in return except the chance to keep showing up for as long as it possibly can. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: you never fully know what a small act of kindness might be healing in someone else. You may never know the whole story behind the stranger in front of you, the hunger they carry, the grief they've never spoken aloud, the sidewalk in their own past they've spent a lifetime trying not to remember. But kindness does not require knowing the whole story first. It only requires choosing in the moment to give your hand instead of walking past. That is the inheritance this story leaves behind. Not a fortune, not a diner chain, not even a building on a street corner, but a simple truth passed quietly from one generation to the next. The people who give without knowing what they are healing are always, in the end, the richest people in the richest room. Now it's your turn. Everyone carries a version of this lesson somewhere in their own life. A moment when a small kindness changed everything, or a moment when you were the one who chose to stop and help a stranger without knowing what it might mean to them. What lesson did this story leave with you? Was it about the courage to trust someone again after being hurt? The quiet strength of a friend like Walt who shows up without asking for recognition? The idea that healing sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, at the most unexpected times? Whatever it is, we would love to hear it. Leave a comment right below this video and share the lesson you're taking away with you today. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that good people are still out there, and leave a comment letting us know your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. See you again in the next video.